Notwithstanding the improvement in the armies of Western Christendom, to which we have referred when speaking of the epoch of the accession of Suleiman, the Ottoman troops were still far superior to them in discipline and general equipment. We have already mentioned the preeminence of the Turks of that age in the numerical force and efficiency of their artillery, and the same remark applies to their skills in fortification and in all the branches of military engineering. The difference between the care that was paid to the physical and moral well-being of Suleiman's troops and the neglect of the miserable fate of the poor soldier in his rivals' camps is still more striking. There are some well-known passages in the writings of Busbequis, the Austrian ambassador at the Ottoman court, who accompanied the Turkish forces in some of their expeditions, in which he contrasts the clean lines and the good order of the Turkish camp, the absence of all gambling, and the sobriety and temperance of the men, with the tumult, the drunkenness, the license, the brawling, and the offensive pollution that raked in and around Christian tents in that age. It were difficult even for the most experienced commissary general of modern times to suggest improvement on the arrangements and preparations for the good condition and comfort of the Ottoman soldiers that may be read of the narratives of Suleiman's campaigns. We may mention as one of many beneficial regulations the establishment of a corps of sakkas or water carriers who attended in the field and on the march to supply water to the weary and wounded soldiers. Compare this with the condition of the black bands who followed Bourbon under the banner and Emperor Charles. An ample revenue judiciously collected and prudently, though liberally employed, was one decisive advantage which Suleiman possessed over his contemporary monarchs. The crown lands of Sultan at that time produced the large sum of 5 millions of ducats. The cease of land tax and capitation tax on the rayas, the customs, and the other regular taxes raised this to between 7 millions and 8 millions. The burden of taxation on the subject was light, and it was only twice in his reign that Suleiman levied an additional impost. The necessity were caused by the sieges of Belgrade and Rhodos in the beginning of his reign, and the cost of an armaments in the year of the Battle of Mohaj compelled him to impose a poll tax on all his subjects without distinction of creed or fortune. But the amount was small on each occasion, and never was a similar measure again necessary. The victorious campaign of the Sultan were soon made to reimburse their outlays, and still further to enrich the port. Large contributions were drawn from Hungary and Transylvania, and Ragusa. Moldavia and Wallachia poured tribute into the treasury of the port. Another less glorious source of revenue was found in the confiscated goods of the numerous high officers of state who were executed during the reign. By invariable usage, the property of those who die thus is forfeited to the crown, and the riches of the Grand Vizier Ibrahim and other unhappy statesmen of this age were no unimportant accessions to the ways and means of the years in which they perished. We examined the general principles of the Ottoman government when reviewing the administration of the empire, received improvement from Suleiman Kanuni, and like another great conqueror and ruler, he has come down to posterity with his legislative works in his hand. He organized with special care the Turkish feudal system of the Siamets and Timars, reforming the abuses which had then already begun to prevail. He ordained that the Timar small fief should be allowed to exist if below a certain value. A number of the smaller fiefs might be united so as to form a Siamet, a grand fief, but it was never lawful to subdivide a Siamet into Timars, except in the case of feudatory who was killed in battle and left more than one son. By permission of the supreme government, several persons might hold a fief as joint tenants, but it was still reckoned a single fief, and any partition and subdivision not especially authorized by the Supreme Court itself was severely punished. The reader who is familiar with the working of the feudal system in Western Europe will perceive how admirably these provisions were adapted to check the growth of evils, like those which the practice of the sub-infeudation produced in medieval Christendom. The Turkish fiefs descended from father to son, like our fiefs entail male. There was no power of device or alienation, and in default of male issue of the deceased holder, the Timar or Ziamet reverted to the crown. It had been usual before Suleiman's time to allow the viziers and governors of provinces to make grants of the lapsed fief within their jurisdiction, but Suleiman restricted this to the case of the minor fiefs. None but the Sultan could make a new grant of a lapsed Siamet, and in no instance did the feudatory who received the investiture of a Timar from the subject pay any homage or enter into any relation of filial duty to the person who invested him. There were no Mecen lordship. The Sipahi was the feudal vassal of the Sultan and of the Sultan alone. The number of the larger fiefs of Siamets in Suleiman's time was 3,192. That of the smaller fiefs of Timars was 5,160. It will be remembered that each sipahi, or holder of a military fief, was not only bound to render military service himself in person, but if the value of fiefs exceeded a certain specified amount, the amount he was required to furnish and maintain an armed horseman for every multiple of that sum, or to adopt the phraseology of our own early institutions. The state was bound to supply the crown in time of war with a man at arms for each knight's fee. The total feudal array of the empire in the reign of Suleiman amounted to 150,000 cavalry, who, when summoned by the Beyler Beys and Sanjak Beys, joined the army at the appointed place of muster and served throughout the campaigns without pay. We must not only add this number to the 48,000 regularly paid and permanent troops when we estimate the military force of the Turkish Empire in its meridian, but we must also bear in mind the numerous squadrons of Tartar cavalry which the Wazar Khans of the Crimea sent to swell the Turkish armies, and we must remember the swarms of irregular troops, both horse and foot, the Akinji and the Azabs which the Sultan's own dominions poured forth to every campaign. There is no surer proof of the true greatness of Suleiman as a ruler than the care which at the same time reformed the Turkish feudal system so as to make it more efficient as an instrument of military force. He bestowed on the condition of those rayas who, like the serfs of medieval Europe, cultivated the lands assigned to the Sipahis. The Kanuni Raya, or Code of the Rayas of Suleiman, limited and defined the rents and services which the Raya who occupied the ground was to pay to his feudal lord. It is impossible to give any description of this part of the Turkish law which shall apply with uniform correctness to all parts of the Suleiman's dominions. But the general effect of Suleiman's legislation may be stated to have been that the recognizing in the Raya rights of property in the land which he tilled subject to the payment of certain rents and dues, and the performance of certain services for his feudal superior. The Englishman who understands the difference between the position of a modern copyholder and that of medieval villain towards the lord of his manor will well understand the important boon which the enlightened wisdom of the Turkish lawgiver secured if he did not originate. And when the difference of creed between the lawgiver and the rayas is remembered, and we also bear in mind the fact that Suleiman, though not a persecutor like his father, was a very sincere and devout Mohammedan, we cannot help feeling that the great Turkish Sultan of the 16th century deserves a degree of admiration which we can accord to none of his crowned contemporaries in that age of melancholy, injustice, and persecution between Roman Catholic and Protestants throughout the Christian world. The difference between the lot of the rayas under their Turkish masters and that of the serfs of Christendom under their fellow Christians and fellow countrymen who were their lords was practically shown by the anxiety which the inhabitants of the countries near the Turkish frontier showed to escape from their homes and life under the Turkish yoke, which is frequently represented as having always been so tyrannical. I have seen, says a writer who was Suleiman's contemporary, multitudes of Hungarian rusties set fire to their cottages and fly with their wives and children, their cattle and instruments of labor to the Turkish territories, where they know that, besides the payment of the tax, they would be subject to no imposts of taxations. Besides the important branches of law and government that have been mentioned, the ceremonial law, a far more serious subject in the East than in Western Europe. The regulations of police and the criminal law received the personal attention of the great Sultan and were modified and remodeled by his edicts. Every subject matter of legislation is comprised in the Reed Code of Ottoman law, compiled by Suleiman's Mullah Ibrahim of Aleppo, which has been in an authority down to the present age in the Turkish Empire. Suleiman mitigated the severity of the punishment which had previously been appointed for many offences. The extreme lightness of the penalties with which crimes of sensuality were visited by him is justly blamed as a concession to the favorite vices of the Turkish nation, but in general his diminution of the frequency with which the punishments of death and mutilation were inflicted entitles him to the prize of the modern jurist. The minuteness of the laws by which they strove to regulate rates of price and weights, and prescribe the mode in which articles of food should be prepared and sold may raise a smile in our more enlightened age. But we should remember now how full our own statute book is of similar enactments, and how far our own excise laws still maintain the spirit of vexatious and mischievous interference. Some of the more noticeable laws of Sultan Suleiman are those by which slanderers and tale-bearers are required to make compensation for the mischief caused by their evil speaking. False witnesses, forgers, and passers of bad money are to have the right hand struck off. Interest is not to be taken at a higher rate than 11%. A fine is imposed for 3 consecutive omissions of a Muslim's daily prayer, or a breach of the Suleiman fasts. Kindness to beasts of burden is enjoined. Whatever the political economists of the present time may think of the legislation of Suleiman Kanuni as to wages, manufacturer, and retail trade, their highest praises are due to the enlightened liberality with which the Phoenician merchant was welcomed in his empire. The earliest of the contracts called capitulations, which guarantee to the foreign merchants in Turkey full protection for person and property, the free exercise of the religion, and the safeguard of his own laws administered by functionaries of his own nation, was guaranteed by Soliman to France in 1535. An extremely moderate custom duty was the only impost of foreign merchandise, and the costly and vexatious system of prohibitive and protective duties has been utterly unknown among the Ottomans. No stipulation for reciprocity ever clogged the wise liberality of Turkey in her treatment of the foreign merchant who became her resident, or in the admission of his ships and his goods. We have already observed in referring to the institutes of Mohammed II, the authority which the ulama or educators and men learned in the law possess in Turkey, and the liberal provisions made there for national education. Suleiman was a munificent founder of schools and colleges, and he introduced many improvements into the educational discipline and rank of the ulama. But the great boon conferred by him on this order, and the peculiar homage paid by him to the dignity of learning, consisted in establishing as rules of the Ottoman government the exemption of all the ulama from taxation, and the secure descent of their estates from father to son, the property of the member of this body being in all cases privileged from confiscation. Hence it has arisen that the only class among the Turks in which hereditary wealth is accumulated in families is furnished by the educational and legal professions, and the only aristocracy that can be said to exist there is an aristocracy of the brain. The splendor of the buildings which, with which Suleiman adorned Constantinople suggests a point of comparison between the great Turkish legislator and the Roman emperor who ruled 10 centuries before him. In addition to that which their codes naturally bring before the mind, it would be dishonoring to Suleiman to carry the parallel between him and Justinian further than as regards architecture and legislation. Nor can there be any balancing of the courage and magnanimity of the victor of Mahaj with the cowardice and means of the unworthy master masks of Belisarius and, and personal ringleader of the factions of the circus. But the long list of in which the Oriental historians enumerate the sumptuous edifices raised by Solomon in the seven-hilled city of Bosporus recalls the similar enumeration which Prosophius has made of the architectural splendors of Justinian. And it was not only in the capital, but at Baghdad, Konya, Kaffa, Damascus, and other cities that the taste and grandeur of Suleiman were displayed. Besides the numerous mosques which were founded or restored by his private liberality, he decorated his empire and provided for the temporal welfare of his subjects by numerous works of practical utility, among them the great aqueduct of Constantinople, the bridge of Çekmece, and the restored aqueducts of Mecca are mentioned as the most beneficial and magnificent.